What would you do if you heard a faint cry for help, but couldn't see anyone around? Would you dismiss it as your imagination, or would you trust your instincts and investigate further? The difference between these two choices could mean life or death for someone or something in desperate need. Prepare yourself for an incredibly moving story of survival, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of one small creature that refused to surrender to darkness. In the bustling outskirts of Portland, Oregon, where nature meets urban development, construction crews worked tirelessly on a new apartment complex. The spring weather had finally cooperated after weeks of rain, and project foreman Mike Delaney was determined to make up for lost time. With deadlines looming and pressure from investors mounting, the site hummed with activity from dawn until dusk, the sounds of heavy machinery drowning out nearly everything else around them. Unknown to the construction workers, a small tabby cat with striking amber eyes had been living in the abandoned lot for months. The locals had nicknamed her Shadow for her elusive nature and her remarkable ability to disappear whenever humans approached. She wasn't feral. Her clipped ear suggested she had once been part of a trap-neuter-return program, but years on her own had made her wary of human contact, preferring to watch the world from a safe distance. Shadow had recently given birth to a litter of kittens, carefully hidden in a small den beneath some discarded wooden pallets at the edge of the construction site. Each day, she would venture out to hunt for food, always cautious, always vigilant, returning to her precious babies who depended entirely on her for survival. Her maternal instincts were strong, her devotion unwavering despite the harsh realities of street life. On this particular Monday morning, Carlos Martinez arrived for his shift earlier than usual. At 52, he was the oldest worker on the site, with calloused hands that told stories of 30 years in construction. Unlike some of his younger colleagues, Carlos never rushed his safety checks and took pride in his methodical approach to work. His wife often teased him about his old-school ways, but Carlos believed some corners should never be cut, especially in construction. The morning had started like any other, the crew meeting to discuss the day's objectives, equipment checks, and safety briefings. The foundation for the East Wing had been poured the previous week and had set properly over the weekend. Today's task was to begin work on the central courtyard area, which required clearing the remaining debris and preparing for tomorrow's cement pour. Shadow had been growing increasingly anxious as the construction encroached closer to her hiding spot. The constant noise and movement had disrupted her hunting routines, making it harder to find food for herself and her kittens. That morning, driven by hunger and the responsibility of motherhood, she ventured closer to the site than she normally would, slinking between stacks of materials in search of mice that were often attracted to the workers' lunch scraps. What happened next occurred in mere seconds, but would change everything. A sudden loud crash from a dropped steel beam startled Shadow, sending her bolting across the open construction area just as a bulldozer was backing up. The operator, unable to see the small cat in his blind spot, continued maneuvering the heavy machine as Shadow, disoriented by panic, fell into a freshly dug 6-foot utility trench. The trench had been prepared for plumbing lines and was scheduled to be filled with a quick-setting concrete mixture that very afternoon. Shadow's fall went unnoticed amid the cacophony of construction noise. No one saw the small tabby cat struggling to climb the steep dirt walls, her claws unable to find purchase in the loose soil. After numerous attempts to escape, exhaustion forced her to retreat to a small pocket of space at one end of the trench, where she curled up, trembling. By noon, the work crew had moved on to the next phase, pouring the concrete foundation for the utility lines. The cement truck arrived on schedule, its drum rotating slowly as it backed up to the trench. Workers positioned the chute and began directing the thick grey mixture into the space where Shadow had fallen. The cat, sensing danger, retreated further into her corner, but there was nowhere to escape as the heavy mixture began filling the trench. Carlos was operating the vibrating tool used to remove air bubbles from the wet concrete when something made him pause. Despite the overwhelming noise of the construction site, he thought he heard something unusual, a faint, desperate cry coming from somewhere beneath him. He switched off his tool and stood motionless, listening intently as his colleagues continued working around him. "Did you hear that?" he asked the worker next to him, who shrugged and continued raking the concrete surface. Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He'd worked with concrete for decades and knew every sound it could make as it settled. This was different. This sounded alive. He raised his hand to signal the cement truck operator to stop pouring, earning confused looks from his co-workers. "Just give me a minute," Carlos insisted, kneeling down closer to the partially filled trench. The concrete had only filled about a third of the space, but it was already beginning to set in the warm afternoon sun. That's when he heard it again, a desperate, muffled cry, and what sounded like scratching coming from beneath the surface of the wet concrete near the far end of the trench. Carlos's heart raced as he realized what might be happening. "Stop everything!" he shouted with an urgency that made everyone freeze. "There's something alive down there in the concrete!" His foreman, Mike, hurried over with a skeptical expression that quickly changed when he too heard the faint sounds of struggle coming from beneath the grey mixture. What followed was a desperate race against time, as Shadow's very life hung in the balance, her strength fading with each passing minute under the crushing weight of the wet cement. "Get me a shovel now," Carlos commanded, already removing his hard hat and gloves. His co-workers looked confused. They were on a tight schedule, and disturbing freshly poured concrete was against every protocol. But there was something in Carlos's voice that brooked no argument, a certainty that transcended workplace procedures and deadlines. Mike hesitated only briefly before nodding to the others to follow Carlos's lead. The concrete was already beginning to set, developing a crusty surface while remaining dangerously fluid underneath. "We need to work fast," Carlos explained as he accepted a shovel from a younger worker. "Whatever's down there doesn't have much time." Several workers gathered around the trench, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and concern. The cement truck operator had shut off his machine but remained in the cab, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Mike pulled out his phone and quickly dialed the project manager. "We've got a situation," he explained tersely. "We need to halt the pour, yes, immediately." The conversation was brief and tense, with Mike finally saying, "I understand the costs. I'm making the call anyway." When he hung up, his face was grim but determined as he turned to Carlos. "You've got 10 minutes to find whatever it is before the suits shut us down." Carlos didn't waste a second, carefully inserting his shovel into the wet concrete near where the sounds had come from. The mixture was thick and heavy, resisting his efforts as he tried to create a channel toward the source of the scratching. With each scoop, the concrete tried to flow back into the space he'd cleared, a grey tide fighting against his rescue attempt. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool spring air. Inside the trench, Shadow's situation was growing more desperate by the second. The concrete had poured around her back legs, trapping her in its rapidly hardening grip. Each breath became more difficult as the weight pressed against her small ribcage. Her survival instinct was fierce, driven not just by self-preservation, but by the knowledge that her kittens were waiting, dependent on her for their next meal and protection from the dangers of the world. "I think I heard it again," one of the younger workers called out, pointing to a spot about 2 feet from where Carlos was digging. Carlos redirected his efforts, moving carefully but with increasing urgency. The concrete was already thick enough that it didn't flow easily, making the rescue attempt even more difficult. "Someone get me a bucket of water," he called out. "We need to slow down the setting." Up above, a small crowd of workers had formed, all tasks momentarily forgotten as they watched the rescue attempt. The site manager had arrived, his face locked in a battle between concern for whatever creature was trapped and frustration at the delay to the project timeline. "Do we even know what we're looking for?" he demanded of Mike, who could only shake his head in response. "Carlos says something's alive down there. That's good enough for me." Shadow's strength was fading. Her initial panicked struggles had given way to more measured, desperate movements designed to keep her head above the encroaching grey mass. The concrete had already engulfed her lower body, its weight crushing and inexorable. The cold mixture burned against her skin, irritating her eyes and nose as chemical reactions began the process of hardening around her small frame. Carlos had managed to clear a small channel in the concrete, but the sounds had grown weaker and less frequent. Fear gripped his heart. Had they already been too late? He thought about his own cat at home, an elderly orange tabby named Rusty, who slept on his pillow each night. The thought of any animal suffering such a fate was unbearable to him. "Just a little longer," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring himself or the trapped creature. At that moment, a strange silence fell over the construction site. The usual cacophony of machinery and shouted instructions had ceased as everyone focused on the rescue attempt. In that relative quiet, Carlos heard it clearly, a weak meow coming from just inches away from his shovel. "It's a cat," he called out, relief and renewed urgency in his voice. "I can hear it. Bring that bucket of water over here." The revelation that it was a cat trapped in the concrete changed the energy of the crowd. Several workers immediately jumped down into the less filled sections of the trench, offering assistance despite the risk to their safety. Someone produced a small garden trowel from a truck, allowing for more precise digging than the large shovel. The site manager's expression softened slightly, though he still checked his watch with concerning frequency. Shadow sensed the vibrations of activity above her, but they were growing distant as her consciousness began to fade. The concrete pressed against her lungs, making each breath a struggle. Her thoughts turned to her kittens, hidden and waiting. They were still too young to hunt for themselves, too vulnerable to survive the dangers of the construction site alone. Their faces, tiny mirrors of her own, flashed before her dimming vision. "I see fur," shouted one of the workers who had joined Carlos in the rescue effort. A patch of dirty grey-brown tabby fur was visible through the concrete slurry, barely moving. Carlos gently poured some clean water over the area, trying to dilute the caustic mixture without further harming the cat. "Easy now," he murmured, working with practiced hands to free the animal without causing additional injury. As they worked to extract Shadow from her concrete tomb, the clock continued to tick. The project manager had arrived and was engaged in a heated discussion with Mike about costs and deadlines. Workers who weren't directly involved in the rescue stood in small groups, watching anxiously as Carlos and 3 others worked to free the trapped cat. The cement in other areas of the trench was already setting firmly, becoming more difficult to disturb with each passing minute. Carlos finally managed to expose Shadow's head and upper body, revealing a small tabby cat covered in grey concrete mixture, her eyes closed and breathing shallow. The cat was unmoving, giving no response, even as Carlos carefully worked his hands beneath her to lift her from the hardening grip of the concrete. "She's still alive," he announced, his voice thick with emotion as he felt the faint rise and fall of the cat's chest against his palms. "But just barely. We need to get her to a vet immediately." Carlos cradled the concrete-covered cat in his work jacket, creating a makeshift nest as he clambered out of the trench with assistance from his colleagues. Shadow's body was alarmingly still, her breathing so shallow that Carlos had to repeatedly check to ensure she was still alive. The concrete had begun to harden on her fur, forming a rigid shell that restricted her movement and threatened to permanently damage her skin and muscles beneath. "My truck's right over there," Carlos said, nodding toward the parking area. "I know a vet clinic about 10 minutes from here." Mike hesitated, glancing at the project manager, who was shaking his head with visible frustration. The day's work schedule was already compromised, and letting a key worker leave would only compound the delay. But one look at the small, suffering creature in Carlos's arms made the decision clear to everyone present. "Go," Mike said firmly, ignoring the project manager's sputtered objections. "We'll handle things here, just let us know." He trailed off, not wanting to voice the possibility that the cat might not survive despite their efforts. Carlos nodded in understanding, already moving toward his truck with careful, measured steps to avoid jostling his fragile cargo. One of the younger workers ran ahead to open the passenger door, concern etched on his face. As Carlos settled Shadow onto the seat beside him, he noticed something troubling. Despite the removal from immediate danger, the cat remained completely unresponsive, her eyes closed and body limp. The concrete was rapidly hardening on her fur, particularly around her hind legs and tail, which had been submerged longest. Carlos started the engine with one hand, while keeping the other gently resting on the cat's side, monitoring her breathing as he pulled out of the construction site. The drive to Eastside Emergency Veterinary Clinic was the longest 10 minutes of Carlos's life. At each red light, he checked on Shadow, whispering encouragements that he wasn't sure she could hear. "Hang in there, little one. Help is coming." The cat had stirred only once, a weak tremble that passed through her body before she fell still again. Carlos pressed the accelerator a little harder, praying that he wouldn't be too late. Dr. Melissa Chen was just finishing with a routine checkup when the clinic's front door burst open. Carlos rushed, still in his dust-covered work clothes, cradling a concrete-encased cat in his arms. "Please help," he said breathlessly. "She was trapped in wet concrete at our construction site. We got her out as fast as we could, but she's barely breathing." The waiting room fell silent as other pet owners looked on with expressions ranging from horror to profound sympathy. Dr. Chen wasted no time, immediately directing Carlos to follow her into an examination room. "How long was she in the concrete?" she asked, already pulling on gloves as her technician prepared the examination table. Carlos shook his head uncertainly. "We don't know exactly. Maybe 30 minutes before we discovered her, another 15 getting her out." The vet's expression grew grave as she gently took Shadow from Carlos's arms and placed her on the table. "The concrete is already setting on her fur," Dr. Chen observed, carefully examining the cat without disturbing her too much. "We need to remove it immediately before it causes permanent damage to her skin and restricts her breathing further." She turned to her technician. "Prepare a warm saline bath immediately and get the emergency kit ready. We'll need to start IV fluids right away. She's severely dehydrated and likely suffering from chemical burns." Carlos watched anxiously as the veterinary team sprang into action around Shadow. The small tabby looked even tinier and more vulnerable under the bright examination lights, her normally sleek fur matted and stiffened by the grey concrete mixture. Dr. Chen worked methodically to insert an IV line into Shadow's front leg, one of the few areas not affected by the concrete. "She's in critical condition," the vet explained to Carlos. "The next few hours will determine if she survives." As the team worked to stabilize Shadow, Carlos found himself pacing the small examination room, unable to tear himself away despite the vet's suggestion that he wait outside. Something about this small cat had touched him deeply. Perhaps it was the desperate cries that had led him to her, or maybe it was the memory of Shadow's amber eyes briefly opening as he'd lifted her from the trench, seeming to look directly into his soul with a silent plea for help. "I need to make a quick call," Carlos said, stepping just outside the examination room door but keeping his eyes on the activity within. He dialed his wife, Maria, usually so pragmatic about strays and wild animals. "I found a cat buried in concrete at the site," he explained without preamble. "I'm at the emergency vet now. She's in bad shape, Maria." His voice caught unexpectedly on the last words, surprising him with the depth of his emotion. Maria's response came without hesitation. "Do whatever needs to be done, Carlos, whatever it costs." In the background, he could hear her already moving around their home, probably preparing a space for the cat when she survived. After 30 years of marriage, he recognized the determination in her voice, the same tone she had used when their youngest daughter had faced a serious illness years ago. It was the voice that said failure was not an option. Back in the examination room, Dr. Chen and her team had begun the delicate process of removing the concrete from Shadow's fur. They worked with warm water and gentle solvents, carefully softening and chipping away the hardened material bit by bit. Shadow remained unconscious throughout the procedure, which Dr. Chen assured Carlos was actually a blessing, given the pain that would accompany such treatment were she awake. "Her vitals are stabilizing," the vet reported cautiously, "but she's not out of danger yet." As the concrete slowly came away, the true extent of Shadow's injuries became apparent. Her skin was raw and blistered in places where the caustic mixture had burned through her fur. Her back legs, which had been submerged deepest, showed signs of potential nerve damage, though it was too early to tell if it would be permanent. Most concerning to Dr. Chen was Shadow's labored breathing, suggesting that concrete dust had been inhaled into her lungs during her desperate struggle. The procedure to clean Shadow took over 2 hours, with Carlos remaining present throughout, occasionally stepping outside to update Mike and Maria on the cat's condition. By the time the last of the concrete was removed, Shadow had been transformed from a rigid grey statue into a fragile, wounded creature. Her fur patchy and skin raw, but undeniably alive. Her breathing had improved slightly with the administration of oxygen, and the IV fluids were helping to combat the dehydration and shock. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Chen said as she examined Shadow more thoroughly now that the concrete was removed. Her hands gently palpated the cat's abdomen, and her expression changed subtly. "She's recently given birth. There are signs that she's nursing kittens." Carlos felt his heart sink at this news. Somewhere at the construction site, Shadow's babies were waiting for a mother who might never return, growing hungrier and more vulnerable with each passing hour. Without hesitation, Carlos pulled out his phone again and called Mike. "The cat has kittens somewhere on the site," he explained urgently. "Can you get some of the guys to look around? They're probably hidden near where we found her." Mike's response was immediate and reassuring. The search was already underway. Several workers had remained after their shift ended, volunteering to help find the orphaned kittens that none of them had known existed until now. Back at the construction site, the day's work had ended early, but the area was far from quiet. Workers spread out in teams, searching methodically through piles of construction materials, under temporary structures, and around the perimeter of the property. Word had spread quickly about Shadow and her kittens, transforming a routine workday into an urgent rescue mission that no one had anticipated when they arrived that morning. Night had fallen by the time Carlos received the call from Mike that sent hope surging through his exhausted body. "We found them," Mike said, his normally gruff voice softened with emotion. 4 kittens, maybe 3 weeks old, hidden under some pallets at the east end of the site. "They're alive, Carlos, hungry and scared, but alive." Carlos closed his eyes briefly in silent gratitude, absorbing the news while watching shadows still form on the treatment table, the steady beep of monitoring equipment providing a rhythmic backdrop to this unexpected development. Dr. Chen had moved Shadow to the intensive care unit of the clinic, where the tabby lay connected to various machines monitoring her vital signs. The prognosis remained guarded. Shadow had suffered chemical burns to her skin, possible lung damage from inhaling concrete dust, and potential nerve damage to her back legs. But against these considerable odds, the small cat had shown remarkable resilience, her will to live evident in the way her condition had stabilized over the past few hours, rather than deteriorating as initially feared. "The kittens need their mother," Carlos told Dr. Chen after relaying Mike's news. "And I think their mother needs them too." The veterinarian nodded thoughtfully, considering the complex situation. "Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't recommend moving critical patients," she began. "But in this case, there's something to be said for the healing power of maternal instinct. If Shadow knows her kittens are near, it might give her something to fight for beyond her own survival." Within the hour, Mike arrived at the clinic, a cardboard box carefully cradled in his arms. Inside, 4 tiny kittens, miniature versions of their mother with the same tabby markings, huddled together, occasionally emitting pitiful mews that spoke of hunger and confusion. Dr. Chen examined each one quickly, confirming they were dehydrated and hungry, but otherwise unharmed. "They've been without milk for several hours," she explained. "We need to get some formula into them right away." The clinic technician prepared bottles of kitten formula while Dr. Chen and Carlos discussed the next steps. "We'll keep them near Shadow where she can see and smell them, but we'll need to hand feed them until she's strong enough to nurse," the vet explained. "If she continues to improve, she might be able to resume feeding them in a day or 2. Carlos nodded, already mentally rearranging his work schedule to accommodate regular visits to the clinic. These 5 lives had inexplicably become his responsibility through a sequence of events none could have predicted. By morning, news of Shadow's rescue had spread throughout the construction company and beyond. Workers arriving for their shifts stopped by Carlos's truck to ask for updates, and the project manager, who had been so concerned about delays the previous day, announced that a portion of the project's contingency fund would be donated to cover Shadow's veterinary bills. "We build homes for people," he said simply. "We can help rebuild one cat's life too." Shadow's first real sign of improvement came shortly after dawn. Dr. Chen had placed the kittens in a heated incubator within Shadow's line of sight, allowing their mother to see and smell them without the risk of them being crushed by her weakened body. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the clinic windows, Shadow lifted her head for the first time since her rescue, her amber eyes focusing intently on the clear-sided box containing her precious offspring. "She knows they're here," Dr. Chen said softly to Carlos, who had arrived early before his shift. "This is exactly what we hoped for." They both watched as Shadow made a visible effort to move toward her kittens, her determination evident despite the obvious pain each movement caused her. The vet gently restrained her, murmuring soothing words. "Not yet, sweet girl. You need to heal a bit more first." Over the next 3 days, Shadow's recovery progressed with a speed that amazed the veterinary staff. The motivation to reunite with her kittens seemed to fuel a healing process that defied medical expectations. Burns that should have taken weeks to heal showed improvement in days. Her breathing grew stronger, and tests revealed that the feared permanent lung damage might be less severe than initially diagnosed. Most remarkably, sensation and movement gradually returned to her back legs, which had been most deeply submerged in the concrete. Carlos visited the clinic twice daily, before and after his shifts, often joined by other construction workers who had participated in the rescue. They arrived in work boots and hard hats, these tough men suddenly gentle and soft-spoken in the presence of the recovering feline family. One worker, a burly equipment operator named Frank, surprised everyone by revealing a hidden talent for bottle-feeding kittens, his massive hands suddenly delicate and precise when holding the tiny creatures. On the fourth day after the rescue, Dr. Chen made the decision that transformed Shadow's recovery. It was time to reunite her with her kittens. Carlos was present for this moment, having arranged to take a long lunch break specifically to witness the reunion. The veterinary team carefully placed the 4 kittens beside their mother on a soft blanket, everyone watching with bated breath to see if Shadow had regained enough strength to care for her offspring. What followed brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Shadow immediately began grooming her kittens, her rough tongue gently cleaning each one as they squeaked and squirmed against her. Despite her injuries, she positioned herself to allow them access to nurse, purring loudly for the first time since her rescue. The sound filled the room, a vibrating testimony to life's persistence and a mother's unconditional love transcending pain and trauma. 2 days later, Dr. Chen pronounced Shadow stable enough to leave the clinic, though her recovery would continue for weeks to come. She needs a quiet place to continue healing and raising her kittens, the vet explained to Carlos. Somewhere stress-free, with regular monitoring. Carlos exchanged a glance with Maria, who had joined him for this consultation, a silent communication born of decades together. Maria nodded almost imperceptibly, answering the unasked question that hung between them. "For they're coming home with us," Carlos announced, his decision made with the same certainty that had prompted him to stop the concrete pour when he first heard Shadow's cries. "We have a spare bedroom that's perfect. Quiet, sunny, away from our own cats until we're sure everyone's healthy." Dr. Chen smiled, having anticipated this outcome from the moment she'd witnessed Carlos's devotion to the injured cat. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already prepared discharge instructions and a care plan." The journey home marked the beginning of a new chapter for Shadow and her kittens. The cat who had survived being buried alive now rode in a carrier on Maria's lap, her kittens nestled securely against her. Carlos drove carefully, avoiding bumps and taking turns slowly, acutely aware of the precious cargo his truck now carried. In the span of less than a week, his life had taken an unexpected turn. 5 new lives now depended on him, a responsibility he had never sought, but now embraced wholeheartedly. At home, the spare bedroom had been transformed into a feline nursery, with soft bedding, climbing shelves at various heights for when the kittens grew more adventurous, and a comfortable chair where Carlos or Maria could sit during their frequent visits throughout the day. Shadow explored the space cautiously at first, testing each surface with a hesitant paw, before finally settling into the nest that had been prepared for her and her kittens, seemingly understanding that after so much hardship, she had finally found sanctuary. 6 weeks passed, transforming both Shadow and her kittens. The once critically injured cat had regained most of her strength, her fur growing back glossy and thick over the areas that had been burned by the concrete. Though she still walked with a slight limp that Dr. Chen believed might be permanent, Shadow moved with increasing confidence around the room that had become her domain. Her kittens had grown from helpless newborns into playful, rambunctious balls of energy, each developing distinct personalities that delighted Carlos and Maria. The construction project continued without Carlos, who had taken a temporary reassignment to the company's planning department, a desk job that allowed him more regular hours to care for his feline charges. His colleagues from the site visited often, bringing toys for the kittens and treats for Shadow, who gradually lost her fear of humans and began to accept gentle petting from this expanding circle of admirers. Most frequent among the visitors was Mike, the foreman who had supported Carlos's impulsive decision that fateful day. "What's going to happen with them?" Mike asked one evening, watching as the kittens tumbled over each other in play while Shadow looked on with maternal pride. Carlos and Maria exchanged another of their silent communications before Carlos answered. "We're keeping Shadow. She's part of our family now. As for the kittens, once they're old enough to be separated from their mother, we'll find good homes for them." He paused, fixing Mike with a meaningful look. "Starting with yours, if you're interested." Word spread throughout the construction company about the kittens' eventual availability for adoption, and soon there was a waiting list of potential homes. The project manager, 2 engineers, and several workers had all expressed interest in providing forever homes to the kittens, whose mother's rescue had united them in an unexpected shared mission. Carlos vetted each application personally, determined that Shadow's offspring would know only safety and love for the remainder of their lives. As for Shadow herself, she blossomed in the Martinez household. The shy, wary street cat gradually revealed herself to be affectionate and intelligent, bonding deeply with Carlos, who had been her first human connection during the rescue. She would often sit beside him in the evenings as he reviewed construction plans at the kitchen table, her presence a quiet reminder of how a single moment of attention, pausing to listen for a sound that could easily have been dismissed, had saved not 1 life, but 5. The story of Shadow's rescue took on a life of its own, spreading throughout the construction company and beyond. Local news picked it up after a worker shared photos on social media, and soon Carlos found himself reluctantly agreeing to interviews, always emphasizing that he had done nothing extraordinary. He had simply paid attention and followed his instincts when something seemed wrong. Anyone would have done the same, he insisted, though many privately wondered if that were truly the case. When Shadow's kittens reached 12 weeks of age, healthy, socialized, and ready for new homes, a small gathering was held at Carlos and Maria's house. The adoptive families arrived one by one to claim their kittens, each receiving detailed instructions on care and feeding, along with a small photo album documenting the kittens' early weeks of life. Shadow watched the proceedings with surprising equanimity, as if understanding that her offspring were moving on to safe futures thanks to the same human intervention that had saved her own life. The construction project was completed 3 months later than originally scheduled, but no one complained about the delay. The incident had transformed the workplace culture in subtle but significant ways. Workers were more attentive to their surroundings, more willing to speak up when something seemed amiss, more connected to each other through their shared experience of the rescue. The concrete trench where Shadow had nearly met her end now formed part of the foundation of a community center that would serve the neighborhood for decades to come. 1 year to the day after Shadow's rescue, Carlos arrived home from work to find Maria putting the finishing touches on a special dinner. On the counter sat a small cake decorated with a cat-shaped silhouette made of frosting. "Shadow's anniversary," Maria explained when she saw Carlos's questioning look. 1 year of her new life. Together they brought a special treat to Shadow, who now claimed the sunniest window seat in the living room as her preferred perch. Her ordeal, a distant memory, replaced by the security of knowing she was home. As they watched Shadow contentedly grooming herself in the evening light, Carlos reflected on how a series of small decisions had aligned to create this moment. His choice to arrive early to work that day, his decision to pause and listen when something didn't sound right, Mike's support when Carlos insisted on halting the concrete pour, Dr. Chen's expertise and compassion in treatment. "Life can change in an instant," he mused aloud to Maria. "Sometimes all it takes is paying attention to the small things that others might miss."